Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome Mark Anderson from America. Welcome, Mark.
Great to be here, Arnie.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Mark. In our pre-talk, we talked about the title for today's discussion, Paradise Denied, and I know that we've done a previous forum with Robert Klink and Wallace Klink, and that was most interesting. And I thought the input, the bouncing around, the input from each other, we tended to build on it to increment of association. So I'm keenly interested in your thoughts as to the state of the world and in particular the medical lockdown. Your thoughts, Mark?
Well, the medical lockdown is a most unfortunate and potentially tyrannical thing. Of course, in some respects, in many people's minds, it's already bordering on or resulting in what many would define as tyranny. Certainly, so many things are happening without our full understanding, certainly without full medical data about the coronavirus being provided, and definitely without our consent. There is not even a pretense of the consent of the governed.
Hmm.
That is one of the most disturbing things. It's one decree and edict after another. While our medical people feel that this is right, and our medical people feel that that's right, and we're just going to recommend this and advise this and require that. But the fact of the matter is that many of us are feeling varying degrees of insecurity and an unsettling feeling, and all this lack of accurate data and contradictory reporting and incomplete recording creates fear. And when fear happens and emotions run high, rational thinking and the truth are the first casualties.
Hmm.
Um, just to give a quick instance before we get into the all important topic of economics and how that induces so much of this,
Yep.
the the worldwide recoveries, and you can go to worldometer.net,
Hmm.
WORLDOMETER.net, and you can check there and Wikipedia and other places, and you can see the relatively high number of recoveries and the fact that the vast majority of people, if they show symptoms at all from coronavirus,
Hmm.
only get mildly ill. And of those that show symptoms of varying degrees, mildly ill, even sometimes seriously ill, the vast majority of them recover.
Yep.
And those that succumb to illness bad enough to die are almost always the elderly or those with underlying conditions.
Yep.
And that's not even including the fact that not all deaths can be certifiably linked to the coronavirus.
Hmm.
There's there's imprecision there. And on the other end of the spectrum, in the testing, I talked to a Italian pastor on Skype who's a registered chaplain with the government,
Hmm.
who told me several weeks back that Italian doctors were just declaring people to have caught the coronavirus, to have tested positive without actually testing them. They would just look at their symptoms and say, yeah, he's got it,
Hmm.
she's got it.
Hmm.
And testing was not always used. And so all this imprecision for testing and not really knowing in every instance if someone who actually actually died, if they actually died of the coronavirus. We don't know, therefore, if the death numbers are accurate, the cases, the number of cases, which is supposed to be based on all this accurate testing, we don't know if that's accurate. And yet we're not told about the recoveries that I mentioned, and the fact that the vast majority of those that show symptoms only get mildly ill and they recover. So, absent that data, you have the fear, because if you only show deaths and cases, this is the number of people we understand are infected, and this is the number we're told are dying, and that's the only data you're given.
Yeah.
That is an automatic inducement to fear.
Yeah.
Because it makes it sound much worse than it is, and it makes it sound like we cannot rectify the problem.
Hmm.
But I'm not here tonight to talk about coronavirus, except to say that that is an element of the fear, that denial of data.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's most profound, Mark. And I know that my previous forum with Wallace and Robert Klink from Canada, and we were talking about the disproportionate, if you like, influence that media has over people's thinking and how it's actually got them to a state of fear. It's imposing terror over them. And of course, the three responses to fear, one is to run away. You can't do that because there's nowhere else to go. You can start fighting it, or you can freeze. You freeze. That's the third option. And I believe that most people are in a state of freeze. They're in a state of fear and they've just frozen themselves solid and they can't actually comprehend that the information they're receiving is fraudulent. It's actually manipulated data and it's all over the place. It's skew if. The key, in my view, to understanding what's going on is actually not to look at the data for the illness, but rather to look at the imposition of, if you like, medical martial law. That to me is the purpose. It is the target. Is the intent behind this fear. The design, if you like, behind it. They want medical martial law. They want to actually lock us down. They want to impose a totalitarian or Bolshevik state over us. And so they're using the coronavirus in order to justify it. It was previously it was climate, originally global warming, and then climate change because the warming wasn't consistent. There was no warming, and of course we had 9/11, and before that we had the Y2K. So we've had 20 years of this type of, if you like, media terrorism being imposed on us to get us to this stage. Your thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, in addition to what you said, Arnie, we've had the H1N1 and
Hmm.
SARS and West Nile.
Hmm.
All these scenarios, regardless of the exact reality and facts of each one,
Hmm.
the action is in the reaction.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of what people do in response to those things. That's what I mean by that. The action is in the reaction.
Hmm.
So yes, the fear specter is held over our heads, regardless of the source of the fear. 9/11, terrorists, global warming, California fires,
Hmm.
uh, errant weather in an age when we're all learning factually, not conspiratorially,
Hmm.
that there is a degree to which governments and private corporations have attempted to and have in fact controlled the weather.
Hmm.
It is no longer a secret. It is no longer folklore.
Yeah.
It was in popular mechanics way back decades ago that the military wanted to own the weather by the year 2025.
Mm-hmm.
This was commonly talked about over the decades.
Hmm.
But digressing from that, um, we have this cancellation of the democratic process going on. And that's another thing people aren't talking about is that, you can't even go to your town hall and redress a grievance because your town hall is closed,
Hmm.
except for those that collect the payments of taxes.
Yeah.
Somehow magically they're open. Of course, you can pay taxes online now and utility bills and things like that. But government's open to receive revenue, but they certainly, as a general thing, don't want to receive your opinion. So not only are we told to stay in our homes, and it's worse in some places than others. Here in South Texas, you can go out, you can go to the store. You just kind of got to have a purpose. Joyriding would be your only real problem, and you don't want to be out real late at night. It's not too bad here, but in other places in the states and elsewhere, it's worse. But it's that nagging feeling in the back of your mind that society is no longer the way it was, and there's media voices such as Technology Review of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Atlantic and other transnationalist one world anti-freedom publications
Hmm.
that are already trying to paint us into a corner and paint a very bleak dystopian future
Yeah.
by saying we're never going to go back to the way we were, or only very little will go back. We're mostly going to be in this new dispensation. We're going to have temperature monitors to take your temperature if you want to board a plane, if you want to go into a train station. We're going to have all these things to monitor your movements. And these are the kind of predictions and prophecy that these publications that are enemies to our freedom are making.
Yeah.
But amidst all this clamor, all the misinformation, all the fraud by the media, uh, the democratic process being almost on total hold, amidst all of this, untouched and uh, unnamed is the monopoly of credit,
Yeah.
the financial framework that all of us and our governments operate within.
Hmm.
Every business, every family, every government has to duff their hat to the money makers, the money masters,
Hmm.
to that control this monopoly of credit. And that monopoly of credit is the complete antithesis of what Wallace Klink and Dr. Oliver Haydorn and Robert Klink and others, including yourself, Arnie, talk about the antithesis of social credit or economic democracy or social credit economics.
Hmm.
Of course, it has nothing to do and no connection with the Chinese surveillance and blacklisting system that they unfortunately named social credit. This, what I'm talking about, this economic reform and renewal and reorientation has nothing to do with that. But the monopoly of credit is over here. What stands opposed to it is social credit economics. And the absence of social credit is creates the kind of conditions, the kind of control over people. It enables a small minority to control the vast majority of people. And without social credit reforms, we allow this monopoly of credit to go on unimpeded and unobstructed.
Yeah.
And that system requires people to work for that system. Every job that every person has in the public and private sector in some way maintains this monopoly of credit, which in turn controls the governments, and the governments in turn control the people.
Yeah.
So by going to work to earn our daily bread, which we need, of course, we are unwittingly feeding the very system that maintains tyranny covertly and overtly. And now we're seeing a more overt version of a tyranny. And this is the important part, Arnie. The
Mm.
tyranny has always been there,
That's right.
ever since the Bank of England and even before back into Babylon and whatnot. But in modern manifestations, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, in 1913 in the United States, that central bank. So underneath the floorboards, this demonic thing has always been there, but it requires a crisis for it to take on more of a overt life, a more active role in our lives.
Yeah.
And 9/11, the coronavirus are merely real, somewhat imagined, in other words, real, somewhat exaggerated, or hoaxes, whatever they might be, depending on what you're talking about, to bring out the fear and to empower this existing monopoly of credit to do overtly what it's always done covertly, and that's track our spending, track our movements, and keep us in bondage.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's only a question of degree. We've been under tyranny for at least since the Bank of England in 1694. The 1913 Federal Reserve in the United States was simply another chapter in that sad historical movement to use the money system to induce slavery and bondage and tyranny, rather than the opposing social credit economic system, which would destroy the monopoly of credit and remove the ability of people to control other people. It would largely do away with the will to power that Wallace Klink talks about on your show, because it would take away the infrastructure by which the few dominate the many.
Yeah. A very important observation there, Mark, and that is that the system itself feeds the power, feeds the power base, the monopoly of credit, if you like. It feeds the power base. So the system itself is purpose built for that. And of course, it does it through indebtedness. And we can see the indebtedness in we've only got to go to the world debt clock or anything like that and have a look at in Australia, the deficits that are going through the roof. And it's not getting any less. The deficit of the government's personal loans are not getting any less. Student debts, the price of homes, all these things are feeding this monster, if you like, this debt monster. And the only way to undo that is to actually turn away from it and think, well, okay, we can see what this system does, and we can see how it promotes debt and it promotes tyranny. And can we think a little further? Can we actually promote something, pursue something that does away with that tyranny. And of course, this is where the pre-thinking done by men such as Clifford Hugh Douglas, the pre-thinking where democratizing credit, placing the money vote in the hands of the individual rather than in an elite. It is so important. It's sort of like, if you like, saying that everyone has an equal vote in Parliament, in Congress, in your representative. Everyone has an equal vote. It can be subject to manipulation, but generally speaking, everyone's vote is of equal value. And so it should be with the economic system, in that the cultural inheritance, that part of the economic system, which is to do with automation, advanced control, which is to do with non-labour devices that are included in the price of any product. Those non-labour devices, there's actually an issue of credit to liquidate that non-labour devices so that the costs of production can be met in a proportionate manner at the place of sale, at the point of sale. They can be liquidated, the cost of production, so that if you turn around and you say, well, this particular factory is going to build 1,000 motor cars because that's what the community wants, and next year it wants to build 900 motor cars, well, obviously there'll be a contraction of the dividend to represent that we don't need as much to cover those cars, so there'll be a contraction in the dividend. But if there's an expansion, a demand for cars, and you want to go to 1,100 cars, then obviously there has to be a greater dividend so that the community can liquidate the extra costs. And that's how it works. It places that voting power, that financial voting power, in the hands of the individual, democratizing the economic system. Mark.
Exactly. You can have a legislative branch, a judicial branch, an executive branch, but when governments take the financial branch, the real fourth estate, it's not the press. The press is not the fourth estate. That's all bunk. That's all just brain candy. The real fourth estate was the ability to, in a sovereign manner, create money free of debt
Mm-hmm.
and put it into circulation in a way that would be on par with the gross domestic product, as you're talking about.
Mm.
When governments gave that away, England in 1694 gave it to the Square Mile, the City of London, the Bank of England,
Mm.
the United States in 1913, the Federal Reserve. They gave away the keys to the kingdom.
Mm.
You can have an executive branch, you can have a Congress that passes laws, you can have a judicial court system, but as one of the Rothschilds said, excuse me, allow me to create a nation's money supply, and I care not who writes its laws.
That's right.
That's because any nation that gives away the financial power has already been conquered.
Mm.
Maybe not vanquished, but conquered.
Mm.
And so, therefore, they can only pass laws or adjudicate laws or enforce laws at the whim of those that own the money power that the government used to have that they gave away.
Yeah.
And so those that privatize and make a private racket out of the money power, money creation power that used to belong to the government, they built this monopoly of credit,
Mm-hmm.
this framework that's like prison walls around all the peoples, all the nations, all the governments. And so we have congressmen and members of parliament that go and vote, but their votes are of little consequence because the system itself cannot be fundamentally changed by any vote or any government action unless that government action begins to change the financial infrastructure in a way that weakens or does away with the monopoly of credit.
Yeah.
So we're in the unenviable position, although in a way it's liberating, Arnie, in my opinion, that the governments are basically dissolved entities, and the people are living under these assumed governments that have given away the most important power they could have, the most creative force that they could exercise, creating money interest free and debt free. Living under those kind of governments, we really kind of revert back to self government in a way,
Yeah.
in many ways, because our governments gave away the one power that matters the most. Therefore, everything they do is of only nominal significance and really kind of futile because they're being controlled and they're operating against the very people they're supposed to represent. That basically nullifies their legitimacy, does it not?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a very interesting comment, Mark. And the only thing I'm sort of visualising in my mind on that, Australia's got a history of our Commonwealth Bank between 1911, 1924. It was the sovereign people's bank, and it issued debt-free money at times to the government, certainly to execute the First World War, but also to expand our infrastructure, East-West Railway Line, Board of Works, woolen mills, steamers, refineries, things like that. So the bank itself, while it was an independent and sovereign instrument, the thing is, if we nationalise our banks, that to me would centralise power in the hands of government, and that's the last thing we want. What we've got to do is differentiate between the sovereignty of issuing credit and where that credit should be allocated. And that's why the national dividend, the what's it called, the National Credit Authority, as an office independent of government, is so vital, because in that it actually looks at the equilibrium of production and consumption, and it holds it in balance, so that the dividend issued to the individual is held in equilibrium. You can liquidate costs and that sort of stuff. Whereas if you hand that monopoly credit creation to government, you only make it a greater tyranny than what it is already. Your thoughts, Mark?
Well, that's always been a kind of a wrinkle in the fabric, Arnie.
Hmm.
I don't know. The National Credit Office, of course, is the office that the conceiver of social credit, Clifford Hugh Douglas, the British Scotch engineer,
Hmm.
that's the entity that he envisioned that would calculate GDP and all the economic conditions and would issue this periodic, sort of like a stimulus check, but periodic dividend to individuals, so much per month, so much per quarter, based on the shortfall between what's produced and purchasing power.
Hmm.
So wherever purchasing power is lacking
Hmm.
behind production, the dividend would fill that gap to equalize purchasing power with production. So there'd be no longer be a gap. It wouldn't put too much money in, because if the money exceeded the production, you could have quite a bit of price inflation.
That's right.
But if the money was too much below the productivity level, then you could have deflation and not enough purchase orders, and then a slowing and contraction of the economy. But the National Credit Office, I don't know that it could be completely independent of government. I think it would be an agency of government that would have wide latitude, but you wouldn't want the National Credit Office to be wholly private, I don't think either,
No.
because then you might run right into the same problem you have with these the private Federal Reserve. Despite its name, it's privately run and owned and controlled. Um, and the way to get around government directing how money is spent, although in a social credit system, I think it's fair to say that a certain part of the money created interest-free, debt-free by the state, and not created by the private banks. Although banks could play an auxiliary role for processing and accounting, but
Hmm.
the money created by government, there would be a certain degree of that for infrastructure, for um, public works, but a large portion of the money through the National Credit Office would be allocated as the first spenders in the economic chain would be the individuals and the families. In other words, a large bulk of the calculated national dividend would go to the consumer sector, and that would, like you indicated earlier, that would be the votes through the way people individually in a free market choose to spend this new money
Hmm.
debt free.
Mm.
That would, the economy therefore would answer to the consumer, the common person in their everyday affairs, building businesses, spending money. And so therefore the economy would have to respond to that, because that's where most of the money is, and that's where most of the spending is taking place.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think the National Credit Office could and probably should be a office of the government, but it should have considerable autonomy and not be politically manipulated to a way in a manner where it can just calculate the data, the productivity levels, therefore to calculate how much of the dividend is needed to fill that gap,
Mm-hmm.
any shortfall between consumer buying power and production, that's the gap,
Mm-hmm.
and go on that way. Um, you wouldn't need to nationalize banks necessarily.
No.
Banks could be privately owned, but they'd have to be reduced to being the mere guardians and processors and accountants of money. They could no longer be allowed to sit in the catbird seat and dictate who gets money and who doesn't, and have enormous interest rates, really high interest rates, um, to where they're creating the money mostly for speculative purposes and inflating the stock market and not really helping Main Street, not helping the average, the regular business community. So banks would have to be disempowered. And here's the irony: that banks would do, under a social credit economic system, banks would do what we think they do now. A lot of people assume banks just, have time deposits like certificates of deposit, and that uh, they loan their money or depositors' money to businesses and individuals. But the fact of the matter is, as you know, Arnie, banks do not loan their own money, nor do they loan depositors' money. They conjure up money that didn't exist before and simply enter digits into a computer ledger. It used to be paper and ink, now it's a computer. The money is created at the stroke of a pen or the tap of a key,
Mm-hmm.
and they use your application for a loan as surety, and they create a demand deposit account, but they do not loan their own money and they do not loan depositors' money, which is what people think they do now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in the future, banks could probably function in the way we think they do now to a limited degree. And I don't want to get too much into the mechanics of banking, but banks would be relegated to purely being service industries, to serve the economy, not to dominate it.
Yeah. No, I think
And
that's a very good illustration, Mark. And to me, it reminds me of the function of an accountant, and that is that
right,
the accountant does the processing of the numbers, and they report an accurate ledger. And but they don't own the assets, nor do they own the values that they're playing with. They just simply manage them, and that to me is the function of a bank, the purpose of a bank. The idea of a national credit authority, the proposal, is that it is similar to weights and measures. It is a demonstratable and, if you like, open source might be a good description of it. That the data that it's actually presenting should be open source and available for all scrutineers, so that the community can actually, those that understand these things can keep an eye on the cookie jar, so that if there happens to be a necessary feedback mechanism, the public using those numbers could actually see it themselves, and then they could argue it out. To me, it's no different in a sense like a commission of weights and measures. They have a function, they have a purpose, and it's quite deliberate. You don't want the weight of a pound or a kilogram to alter, or the length of a metre or a foot to alter. You want it there as consistent. And so to me, that's the function of the National Credit Authority, understanding that there are costs that go into prices, that you do produce things as a community, and that in the end, that gross domestic product is there. It's there for everyone to see. And the purchasing power is also there in the form of wages, dividends, and salaries. What is the actual purchasing power? Now, I put a notice up on our website, I think it was by Orage, and it showed that the actual spending power is as $1 is to four. It's actually, at that stage, 1930s, it was 25% of the actual total cost was in wages and dividends, 25%. I think the number's different now, but the fact is that they could measure it in the 30s, and if they can measure it then, they can certainly measure it now. So yes, the economic system has a purpose. There is an intent behind it, that there is a design with an end objective, and the end objective could be one of tyranny, which it is now, or the end objective could be one of freedom and emancipation. And I know that William Wilberforce, when he fought against slavery, it was not something that was easy. It took a lifetime virtually. But in the end, the circumstances were such that he overcame it. And against all odds, he overcame it. And no doubt this is a similar situation, Mark, that against all odds, it's up to us to overcome it. And no better time than this Holy Week to think on these things. Your thoughts, Mark?
Well put, Arnie. And I was trying to think of that word earlier. You saved me. I was thinking, what is that word that's like liberalization, only it's a little bit more grand, and that's it, emancipation.
Hmm, hmm,
That is the word for Holy Week. That's the word for every week.
hmm,
We need to be emancipated from the monopoly of credit
hmm.
that makes us go to a job every day, get up, work, come home, have dinner, go to sleep, get up, do the same thing over and over and over again. But we were born to do more than just go to work, pay bills, and die. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
And um, yes, the system, and this is where we really zero in on it. When you go to work, this is what we have to understand. A lot of people, they have this mentality, well, these lazy freeloaders over here, they're on welfare, they're on food stamps, and I've got a job. I'm a proud American or Canadian, whatever I might be. I'm a productive, you know, human being. I'm not a parasite. But the fact of the matter is a person who's on welfare is only nominally more in bondage than a person with a job. Whether you're working a job or on welfare, you're still in bondage.
Yeah.
You're still dependent. You still have a strong dependency. One is a little different than the other. The welfare system, there's means testing, uh, income ratings, and all sorts of things to make sure you qualify. And they want a lot of data about you, and they're going to keep an eye on you a little bit, and that's unpleasant and anti-freedom.
Hmm.
But having a job is no emancipation or liberation.
No.
Um, not enough to matter. Someone like myself and others who are self-employed, there's that little extra degree of freedom, but with that comes other uncertainties.
Hmm.
So some of the advantages are somewhat canceled out or muted by some of the disadvantages.
Hmm.
But the system is set up, as we indicated earlier, and I'm just getting into more depth, the system is set up to where when you work your job, you're feeding the very system that controls us
Hmm.
and controls our governments because the system will only accept those that accept it. So we're now getting into the social credit system of the wrong kind in China, where and we see this with credit ratings by the banks and by the credit rating agencies like Equifax and Moody's. Individuals and whole nations are given credit ratings by private bankers and financial wizards.
Hmm.
We're told what we're worth. The banks dictate what we're worth.
Hmm.
That Mark Anderson, well, that guy's, he's only a 700 credit rating. We're not going to loan him any money to refinance his house because we, the banks, not Mark's neighbors, not anybody that can vouch for his character, but we, the banks, determine what Arnie Luks and Mark Anderson are worth and what their labor is worth and what their credit is worth. And we stamp a number on them. And now it's getting to the point where, well, if we don't like their political views, we can just switch off their debit card.
Yeah.
That's just around the corner with like Real ID, where um, you need an internal passport and you've got all this data about your personal self and all these databases around the world. And so uh, in China, they can prevent you from getting on a train or deny you a job or get you demoted, all sorts of social and financial penalties if you don't toe the line according to the Chinese communist philosophy.
Yeah.
And that is being enlarged to now where banks can deny you credit based on all sorts of unknown factors. See, so you go to work every day, you do the best you can, but the financial system can still dictate to you whether you get credit or not,
Yeah.
and they never have to reveal to you fully why you were denied credit.
Yeah.
So you're on this hamster wheel. You don't know from day to day whether you can get that next loan to pay off a previous loan, because that's all there is debt. It's a debt-based system, not a debt-free system.
Yeah.
So you're completely at the capricious you're completely at the mercy of the capricious banks and the overall capriciousness of the system.
Hmm.
It can decide from one day to another whether you're credit worthy or not, no matter how long you've worked, no matter how hard you've worked. So the system consistently dictates more and more of your life. The the uh, the hamster wheel that you're running on, or the treadmill that you're running on, gets steeper and steeper and steeper, and faster and faster and faster, and you have no consent or control over any of this. You're just a hardworking person doing the best you can. So the monopoly of credit will dictate how fast you have to run, how steep the hill is that you're running on, and in a very capricious way, it will determine day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, whether you're credit worthy or not. And you have no say so over the criteria by which you're judged credit worthy.
Hmm.
So, is this the system we want to work for? Or do we want to get into a system where the total amount of production is given a value, and that value is added to the credit side of the ledger at the National Credit Office, and the nation gets richer rather than going into debt.
Yeah.
And based on that higher productivity, we're all paid a dividend to cover for any shortfalls between purchasing power and the final price tags of all goods and services. And the more production there is, the more wealth is added. The more wealth that's added, the larger the dividend.
Yeah.
And therefore, we don't have to work as much. We have more leisure time and more money in our pockets and more leisure time. And we're finally freed from having to go to work every day. We finally can take our nose off the grindstone and get a dividend based on all the wealth that's already been produced,
Hmm.
which is based on all the knowledge and the cultural heritage, the industrial arts, all the scientific and technical and industrial things we've learned over all the decades and the centuries. All of that knowledge leads to automated production, uh, uh, artificial intelligence used for humane purposes.
Hmm.
There are humane uses for those things. It doesn't have to lead to a dystopian tyranny. And all that accumulated knowledge, you know, takes the yoke off our backs. We get a dividend. We don't have to work as much. We can pursue our calling in life. And that kind of interest-free, debt-free system where work is no longer obligatory, but is more of a choice.
Yeah.
That is within our reach if only we had the knowledge.
That's right, and it is. It's for want of knowledge. That's the thing that is not letting us be set free to achieve our own heaven on earth. It's that's a fascinating picture that we've painted today in today's forum, Mark, and I have really enjoyed you coming. The only comment I'd make to close out my thoughts on it is that you used the word, and it was in a sense a general perspective on those that are unemployed. They're essentially a parasite on the system. But in actual fact, what it is those that are unemployed or destitute or homeless, is they are refused their inheritance. They're refused their inheritance by the actual
Yes.
parasite over the system. The parasite over the system is the modern monetary system. That's what's going on. It is a parasite. It has sucked the life out of the whole thing, and it's got to the stage where it's essentially killing the host. And there are a couple of books out there. Hudson, I think it is, has written a couple of books on that, as being just exactly that, a parasite. And the thing is that historically, I think it's Brooks Adams writes about the law of civilization and decay, and he shows even in the first chapter, he shows that it was the manipulation of the financial system that in the end caused the collapse of that civilization. It caused the collapse, and it's been done again and again and again, and we're watching it unfold in front of us, the collapse of our own civilization. We can do something about it, but it takes effort. As you've said, you've been at this for 11, 12 years, and I've been at it for a little bit longer. But we're all in different stations in life, and we're all at different levels of understanding. And it's based on, can we actually face the other way? Can we turn away from this and find a proper way, a proper equilibrium where the individual, the homeless, the destitute receives their fair share of the cultural inheritance? I'll call for closing comments, Mark.
I'm glad that you said that, Arnie. Yeah, when I refer to the welfare state and those receiving welfare as, you know, being seen as freeloaders, that is the view of the common person that doesn't understand the bigger picture. That's not my view.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely right. The irony is that um, someone spending food stamps into the economy is just as good as someone spending money. There's such a lack of purchasing power that a food stamp is just as good as a dollar,
Hmm.
in the sense that it's taking care of a purchase that needs to happen. But setting that aside and getting into the closing perspective, yeah, the real parasite is absolutely those that run the monopoly of credit, which is the old line families and people that have been in the banking monopoly business for generations. Names like Rothschild and Warburg come to mind. But regardless of their names or backgrounds, the nature of the system is such where every day we go to work, we keep the dragon alive and we keep the fire breathing.
Hmm.
And we need to change the system fundamentally so the work we do choose to do is our choice and it's meaningful. It's not just drudgery. It's not just working for the sake of working. And where we can live in maybe not a heaven on earth in the with a capital H, but certainly a vastly improved and humane society. And compared to what we have now, it would seem like heaven on earth as it is in heaven, right? Like in the Lord's Prayer.
The Lord's Prayer.
And
Mm.
yeah, a good way to, you know, respect and recognize Holy Week here
Hmm.
as we speak on April 5th, 2020. At least that's the date here in the States right now. And yes, it's sobering to think of what we could have and we don't, and how much it's within our grasp, and yet we can't quite reach it because, as it says in the Bible in the book of Hosea, my people perish for a lack of knowledge. And but it doesn't have to be that way. I've made some brochures and pamphlets that I hand out to providers when I go through like a food drive-through or a bank drive-through or
Hmm.
a waiter or a waitress. It's a threefold. The article that the threefold pamphlet is based on is on my website, thetruthhound.com, and
Hmm.
it's called Springboard to Prosperity.
Hmm.
I need to update it, but Springboard to Prosperity at thetruthhound.com, my threefold is based on that. I'm going to put the PDF for the threefold pamphlet up there too soon, as soon as I can. But it's a kind of an everyday layman's way of explaining it to the working class, to the waiters and the waitresses and the construction workers. We've got to hand out the literature. We've got to keep on keeping on, as they say, and discuss it like we are in your show, and promote everything we can in every way we can to get the word out that the those that would impose a medical tyranny on us are empowered because we're so disempowered by the monetary system.
Hmm.
We've been under the heel of that system, what the author Jack London called the iron heel. Um, we've been under the heel of that system for so long we don't quite realize it's there, that tyranny, the monetary tyranny under the monopoly of credit. But that monopoly of credit owns the medical system directly and indirectly, and they've bought and owned the media for a long time.
Yeah.
That's why there's such a concentration of ownership in the media. So through this monopoly of credit, we get the medical monopoly, we get the media monopoly, and these monopolies are all operating in tandem with each other, but the financial monopoly came first.
Mm.
Then came the medical and media monopolies, roughly hand in hand, and they all promoted each other.
Yeah.
And so that's why we only get one narrative. The only thing to do is vaccines. The only answer is to develop a vaccine when we have naturopathic and homeopathic and nutritional healing that's been with us a very long time.
That's right.
The monopoly of credit, the financial monopoly dictates these things through the media and through the medical system. And that's why the real ultimate problem, the real ultimate tyranny is that financial tyranny that we're talking about and the solutions that we have toward that. And that's what empowers, again, the media and medical monopolies and what we're seeing imposed on us now through the coronavirus. So if we get at the real heart of the problem, the financial tyranny, the rest of it would go away. We would see a democratization of the medical system, and we'd see a democratization of the media system
Hmm.
if we democratize the money system,
Hmm.
the monetary system. So I think that pretty much summarizes it.
Mark Anderson, this has been an excellent forum, and I really appreciate your input and you coming on board. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Arnie, and thanks for having me on here at a somewhat unusual hour. But this stuff needs to be said. We need to get the word out because we need to see what's behind the curtain. The coronavirus is just one manifestation of a very old game.
Hmm. Thank you so much.